All right, hello once again. It looks like we're going to be continuing to do this for a while because the coronavirus is only, it seems, getting started. So this may go on at least for the remainder of the semester and potentially even through the summer semester. So what I'm going to do today is finish chapter 8. On Friday, I'm going to post a test in the morning probably, so it's going to contain some essay questions that I want you to be able to do to make sure that you're getting the concepts that we're talking about in the videos as well as within the text in your book. So keep reading the book as well as listening to the videos, and we're going to go through till the rest of the semester. We'll go through chapters 9 through 13. So we'll then stop there in the summer session. If you decide to take EABS II then, we'll continue on through the rest of the book. So last time we were talking about neurocrine molecules, and we said that there are many different neurotransmitters that are present within the body. In the peripheral nervous system, you typically have only a limited number, in particular acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Within the central nervous system and the enteric nervous system, you have many more, as we saw on the slide here. You have serotonin, dopamine, all sorts of different GABA receptors, amino acids, in particular glutamate. So we're going to continue going through how the nervous system works and how the different branches coordinate with one another. We'll see that the autonomic nervous system tends to help maintain and regulate homeostasis. The sensory nervous system helps to keep you apprised of what is going on in the environment. We'll talk about the special senses, which include vision, hearing, taste, olfaction, as well as the vestibular system. So we'll keep going on until we go through all of that information, and hopefully it gives you a better understanding of how the body coordinates with itself to make sure that everything typically is going appropriately. So we'll see that the body communicates via the nervous system and the endocrine system, and those all use the signaling molecules that bind to receptors. So we'll see that in the nervous system, particularly on the dendrites, you have a lot of input that is going into those particular nerves that can either depolarize or hyperpolarize the nerve. So in the case of hyperpolarization, that means that it's making the interior of the cell more negative and thus less likely to depolarize once the signal reaches the trigger zone. Remember, we talked about graded potentials and action potentials. The graded potentials typically are summed at the trigger zone, and that then, when the signal is suprathreshold, allows an action potential to propagate, and then you get release of neurotransmitter that then is going to cross the synaptic cleft to either another neuron, a muscle cell, endocrine cell, all the different examples that we talked about. So in typical, or in particular, what kinds of responses have we said that binding of a neurotransmitter or hormone can cause? It can activate an enzyme, it can activate an ion channel to open or close in some cases. It can also activate G proteins, and G proteins can in turn do many of those same things. It can cause internalization of substances, phagocytosis, endocytosis. You can also have exocytosis of substances. So this just goes over a brief summary of those processes. So a neurotransmitter, when it binds to the receptor, you can get ion channels opening, closing. You can have G proteins being stimulated. The G proteins can activate other enzymes, and when you look, you notice that you have both excitatory and inhibitory postsynaptic potential. So if you open an ion channel that allows sodium to come into the cell, you're going to increase the positive charge and potentially depolarize that cell once the signal reaches the trigger zone. Whereas in the case of having more potassium leave the cell, so if you open up potassium channels, that's going to actually hyperpolarize the cell. And you can see that's called an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. Same way with opening a chloride channel. So opening a chloride channel allows chloride to go into the cell, making it more negative. So remember that when you open a channel fully, it goes toward the Nernst potential of whatever that ion channel is allowing to move. So typically the Nernst potential, remember, of sodium is approximately plus 66. The Nernst potential of potassium is approximately minus 90. So when ion channels close, if you let less sodium in, that's also going to be inhibitory because you're less likely to get positive charge into the cell, so that by the time the signal reaches the trigger zone, it's not going to trigger an action potential. And also closing potassium channels. By closing potassium channels, you increase the potassium inside a cell, and that increases the charge, which then depolarizes the cell. So that's going to be an excitatory postsynaptic potential. Okay, so what happens to the neurotransmitter after it's released from the nerve? It can either diffuse away, it can be taken back up into the nerve, or typically it can be degraded by enzymes that may or may not be present on the postsynaptic membrane, or potentially even within the neuron itself. So, for instance, there are enzymes called monoamine oxidase that degrades norepinephrine when it's taken back into the cell. So monoamine oxidase inhibitors are a class of medications that literally are going to increase your concentration of norepinephrine within the synaptic cleft by decreasing the degradation. So there are a number of different methodologies that pharmacologists have to treat patients based on different cellular mechanisms. So the hormone can also diffuse away. Remember that the occupancy of the receptor is what determines whether or not the signal is going to be transduced across the cell. So the more time that that receptor is occupied, the more that signal transduction pathway is going to be active, and whatever it's tied to, whether or not it's an enzyme or an ion channel, is going to be doing its particular job. All right, so here you can see an example again of a synaptic cleft. You can also have glial cells, which is very common, particularly within the nervous system, even in the peripheral nervous system. So when the action potential reaches the terminus, you open voltage-gated calcium channels. Calcium comes in, which then causes exocytosis of the neurotransmitter. You get binding to the receptor, and that then activates the downstream cell. And you may or may not have an enzyme. For instance, if this was a motor nerve, you can have acetylcholine being released. When acetylcholine binds to the receptor, a motor nerve in the muscle cell will be, the muscle cell will be activated, and that causes the muscle to contract. The acetylcholine can then be degraded by the acetylcholinesterase. And in fact, there are acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. And when you spray a cockroach with a spray, many of the sprays actually have acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, and it causes stimulation, more activity of the acetylcholine because it's not being broken down, and you see the cockroach twitching, and they actually start to die because you also are going to increase the concentration of acetylcholine, which we'll see is active in the autonomic nervous system. And that can cause problems in the respiratory tract as well as the cardiac system. So that can lead to untoward effects. And there are many different potent acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. I believe, for instance, sarin gas is one of the more potent acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. All right, so integration of signals, you can have what are known as divergent or convergent pathways. Information that is coming from the periphery typically gets integrated and sent via nerves and go into the spinal cord via spinal nerves. And we'll see that different parts of the body can actually coalesce into a single neuron that ultimately goes into the brain. And we'll talk about the region of the brain called the somatosensory cortex that actually interprets all of that. So we'll see there's a phenomenon called referred pain that is due to many of these convergent pathways. For instance, if you're having a heart attack, you may experience chest pain or pain in the left arm or back pain. And that all has to do with the heart sending pain signals when it has ischemia to the same region that the areas in your body send the signals when they have pain as well. And usually the body is interpreting those signals as coming from, for instance, the left arm or the jaw. But in the case when it's coming from the heart, the body may still think it's coming from the left arm because that single nerve ultimately is being stimulated. Divergent pathways, where you have one cell going to many, that can be the case in the central nervous system. So this is an example of where you have one nerve that controls many other nerves and then go to different regions within the body. The example of the convergent pathway is here, where you have different areas, like from the heart, the left arm, or whatever, all stimulating a particular nerve that the brain interprets from that particular area. All right, so when you look at the central nervous system, you can actually see that there are trillions of nerves within the brain, and many of those nerves have input from up to a couple 100,000 other nerves. So getting an integration of the signal, you can imagine all these different nerves. Some of them may open one type of channel, another may open another type of channel, all depending on the neurotransmitter that's released and the receptor that it binds to. So ultimately, whether or not this nerve is going to fire depends on what the signal and potential at the trigger zone is. If that potential is suprathreshold, it fires an action potential, whereas if it's below threshold, it's not going to fire an action potential. Remember, action potentials are all or none, whereas graded potentials typically depend on either spatial or temporal summation and the overall signal as it reaches the trigger zone. Okay, so you have additive strength of those signals as they reach the trigger zone, and you can have multiple either excitatory or inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, which then travel through the cell body. So here's an example where you have spatial summation, 3 different axons are terminating on the dendrite. So you send the neurotransmitter across the synaptic cleft, it binds to a receptor. In each one of these 3 cases, it causes an excitatory postsynaptic potential. And in an example of spatial summation, these 3 ultimately at the trigger zone are going to add so that at the trigger zone, the signal is going to be suprathreshold, and you're then going to generate an action potential. But what happens if you have an inhibitory? For instance, if that particular nerve releases a neurotransmitter that opens a chloride channel. In that case, you're not going to get a significant depolarization, or the potential at the trigger zone is not going to be enough to generate an action potential. So if it's too weak, nothing then is going to happen. Okay, so looking at the nervous system, it's an extremely complex system from infancy to adulthood. You've got to have all of these things going right, and even in the process of embryogenesis, you've got to have all the different nerves finding everything that they need to innervate. So there's got to be growth factors and signals that tell those nerves where to go. So you have neurotropic factors, you have all sorts of things, and with everything in the body, there's a typical use it or lose it phenomenon. So the less that you use something, the more it's going to deteriorate, whether it's a muscle or whether it's your brain. So one of the things that they talk about, particularly for elderly individuals, that is extremely important is that keeping your mind active. So you see many individuals trying to stave off dementia doing mind games, puzzles, also social interaction. Reading keeps the mind stimulated and allows you to maintain all those nerves that are so integral to your personality and overall functioning. If that starts to deteriorate, like if you're put in a nursing home and nobody comes to visit you and you're just in a bed every day and there's no stimulation, you literally start getting atrophy in those nerves within the brain, and that is a terrible situation because then you start losing your ability to think. And dementia is common, very common in many hospitalized and elderly patients, particularly in nursing homes where they don't get a lot of social interaction. We've talked about before the different pathologies found in the nervous system. We said Parkinson's disease, you literally lose a portion within the brain that secretes dopamine.